Hey everyone! Before this story pulls you under, take a second to ground yourself because what you're about to hear is not just a tale of betrayal, but a slow-burning collapse of a life that looked perfect from the outside. If you believe in truth rising from silence, power emerging from patience, and consequences arriving exactly on time, make sure you like, subscribe, and stay with me until the end. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where buried secrets never stay buried. This story began in a house that smelled of antiseptic and dying flowers, in a room where time seemed to hold its breath. For years, I had lived inside a marriage that felt solid, respectable, and carefully polished for the world. My husband was admired, trusted, and untouchable in the eyes of everyone who knew him. He was successful, disciplined, and generous with his public image. People described him as a man who carried responsibility effortlessly, a man whose hands were always clean. I was the woman beside him, quiet but observant, loyal but never blind. I had learned early that survival in certain families required silence more than strength. His family was powerful in subtle ways, bound by unspoken rules and inherited expectations. At the center of it all was his mother, a woman whose authority did not need volume. She ruled with glances, with timing, with what she chose not to say. When illness reduced her to a fragile figure in a hospital bed, everyone assumed her power had faded. Doctors spoke softly, nurses moved carefully, and relatives whispered their goodbyes too early. I sat at her side because it felt like duty, because I had been raised to honor endings, even when beginnings had been cruel. No one expected her to speak again. Her breathing had become shallow, her body thin as if life had been slowly leaking out for years. Yet there was something restless in her presence, something unfinished. I noticed it long before anyone else did. In the way her eyes tracked movement. In the way her fingers tightened whenever my husband entered the room. In the way silence grew heavier instead of calmer. I had always known there were cracks in the story I had married into. Financial inconsistencies brushed aside with charm. Late-night absences explained with professionalism. Documents locked away, conversations ended when I entered the room. I told myself it was none of my business, that love required trust and trust required restraint. That restraint would cost everyone dearly. The final day arrived without ceremony. No dramatic signs, no urgent calls. Just another morning where the air felt too still. Family members gathered, prepared for closure, not revelation. My husband stood composed, grieving in a way that looked appropriate. I watched him carefully, not knowing why unease crept through me like cold water under skin. Then his mother stirred. It was not a miracle moment. It was not peaceful. It was deliberate. Her eyes found me, not her son. Her hand moved with effort, reaching for mine. The room shifted, though no one else seemed to feel it yet. When she spoke, it was not to say goodbye, not to confess love, not to offer blessings. It was to finish something she had started years ago. Her voice was weak, but the intention behind it was razor sharp. She said very little. Only enough. Only what mattered. Names, actions, and a truth that did not belong in that room, but refused to stay hidden any longer. She gave me what she could not give the world earlier. Proof without paper. Direction without explanation. A final act of control that would outlive her. Her body relaxed moments later. Machines confirmed what everyone already sensed. The matriarch was gone. But nothing had ended. I sat frozen, holding the weight of what she had entrusted to me. I understood immediately why she had chosen me. I was the only one who could act without being suspected. The only one who had been underestimated long enough to move freely. The days after her death passed in a blur of rituals and appearances. Mourning clothes, polite condolences, rehearsed sorrow. My husband moved through it all flawlessly, accepting sympathy, giving thanks, standing tall. No one questioned him. No one ever had. Except now I did. What she had revealed rewrote every memory I had suppressed. The unexplained wealth. The sudden career jumps. The fear hidden behind my husband's discipline. The way his mother had always watched him, not with pride but with calculation. I did not confront him. I did not cry. I did not accuse. I did what women like me learn to do when the ground shifts beneath them. I observed. At night, while he slept peacefully, I connected pieces that had never fit before. I reviewed timelines. I remembered names mentioned once and never again. I recognized patterns that had been disguised as coincidence. The picture that formed was not just betrayal. It was criminal. And it was ongoing. The final whisper of a dying woman had not been a confession of guilt. It had been a warning. And perhaps a request. I realized then that the story was no longer about my marriage. It was about accountability. About what happens when powerful men believe silence is permanent and women are invisible. I was neither. The path ahead would require patience, precision, and a willingness to let everything burn if necessary. I understood that once I stepped forward, there would be no return to normal. Only truth or destruction. As the funeral ended and the doors closed behind us, my husband reached for my hand, unaware that the woman beside him no longer belonged to his world. The queen had awakened. And the next move would not come from grief but from strategy. Grief gave me cover. In the days following the funeral, everyone expected withdrawal, tears behind closed doors, emotional exhaustion. No one questioned my distance. No one noticed my focus sharpen instead of dull. Silence became my greatest advantage because while others mourned what they thought they had lost, I began studying what had been hidden all along. The house felt different now. Without his mother's presence, my husband moved with less restraint, as if a watcher had finally disappeared. That alone confirmed what her final whisper had suggested. He was not free because she was gone. He was exposed. I started with memory. I replayed years of marriage like evidence footage, stripping moments of their emotional cover. I catalogued absences, sudden relocations, acquaintances who appeared briefly and vanished, wealth that arrived without explanation but was never discussed. I remembered the way financial conversations ended abruptly, the way paperwork was always handled, the way certain rooms were always locked. I moved carefully because men like my husband never build alone. They surround themselves with systems, buffers, and blind spots. And I was certain that if I rushed, I would disappear into one of those blind spots forever. So I became invisible in a different way. I cleaned. I organized. I archived. I positioned myself as harmless routine. While doing so, I learned the geography of his secrets. Hidden safes disguised as wall fixtures. External drives labeled with meaningless codes. Old phones stored like trophies, not trash. He was arrogant enough to keep history close, convinced that no one would dare examine it. He underestimated grief. He underestimated me. At night, when he slept deeply, I studied his devices without urgency. I never rushed downloads. I never altered files. I documented patterns instead of chasing answers. Transactions traced to shell companies. Communications routed through third parties. Repeated references to operations that did not align with his public profession. This was not a single crime. It was a network. And then there were the names his mother had given me. I treated them like coordinates, not conclusions. Each one led to another layer of confirmation. Public records. Quiet inquiries. Archived articles scrubbed from common searches but still preserved in forgotten databases. What I found wasn't rumor or suspicion. It was federal. The magnitude of it pressed against my chest, not with fear but with clarity. My husband was not simply corrupt. He was operational. Protected by influence and timing but not invisible. What his mother had done was not a last act of love. It was an act of containment. She had watched this machine grow and understood too late that it would destroy everything it touched, including her. And when death stripped her of control, she handed it to the only person who could dismantle it quietly. Me. I did not ask whether I should act. That question belongs to people who still believe neutrality is possible. Once you see the truth clearly, inaction becomes a choice. And I had already chosen. The question was how. Going to authorities without preparation would be suicide. Powerful men do not fear accusations. They fear documentation, patterns, corroboration, and timing. I needed to ensure that when the truth surfaced, it would arrive fully formed, undeniable, and too late to bury. So I built a shadow archive. Everything I found was duplicated, encrypted, and stored in locations my husband would never access. Physical copies sealed and placed where destruction would be impossible. Digital trails mapped and preserved so that deletion would only confirm guilt. I was not collecting evidence to confront him. I was building a case to survive him. All the while, I maintained the illusion of loyalty. I attended events. I smiled beside him. I listened without reacting as he spoke about legacy, reputation, and control. His confidence grew daily, fueled by the belief that he had outlived his greatest threat, his mother's oversight. He mistook my silence for ignorance. He mistook my calm for weakness. Men like him always do. What I did not anticipate was how quickly the machine would sense disruption. Subtle changes followed. Unexpected schedule shifts. Increased security. New passwords. He was tightening access, perhaps unconsciously responding to a threat he couldn't name. Time compressed. I realized then that I could not move alone. The scale of what I held required an authority immune to influence, an entity with reach, resources, and patience greater than his. And there was only one. The Federal Bureau of Investigation. The decision did not come with drama. It came with inevitability. Once named, it settled into me like gravity. I did not fear them. I feared delaying. But even this required strategy. I did not walk into an office. I did not make a call from home. I initiated contact through channels designed for protected informants. Every step was measured, anonymized, and documented. I provided samples, not the whole truth. Enough to trigger interest. Enough to confirm credibility. Enough to open a door without revealing my face. The response was faster than expected. That alone told me something critical. They had been circling him already. From that moment forward, my life split in two timelines. The visible one, where I remained a devoted wife in mourning. And the hidden one, where I became a living key to dismantling a federal-level operation. Surveillance expanded beyond my husband. Wrapped around me as well, protective but watchful. I followed instructions precisely, understanding that deviation could compromise everything. I provided access points, behavioral patterns, and predictive insights no outsider could ever gather. And slowly, methodically, the trap began to close. I felt no triumph. No excitement. Only resolve. Because this was not revenge. It was correction. What haunted me most was not fear of discovery, but the realization of how close I had come to disappearing into his world permanently. How easily love could have buried truth. How many women lived inside similar silences, never realizing they were standing on fault lines. I would not be one of them. As weeks passed, federal interest escalated into preparation. Warrants took shape. Operations were timed. The machine my husband had built so carefully was being mirrored, analyzed, and prepared for dismantling by something far larger than him. And still he suspected nothing. The night before everything changed, I stood alone in the house and understood the weight of what was coming. There would be no reversal. No reconciliation. No return to innocence. Only exposure. And when it arrived, it would not knock politely. It would take him away in full view of the world he thought he controlled. The morning everything unraveled began like any other, which was precisely why it worked. Normalcy is the strongest disguise. My husband moved through the house with his usual precision, dressed in confidence, insulated by routine. He spoke about schedules, obligations, future plans that would never materialize. He believed the day belonged to him. He believed the world remained obedient. I watched him carefully, not with fear or hesitation, but with a detached clarity that surprised even me. When you live long enough inside someone else's constructed reality, the moment it collapses feels less like chaos and more like correction. I had already grieved the man I thought I married. What remained was simply a subject of consequence. The weeks leading up to this day had been quiet on the surface and relentless beneath it. Federal agents had confirmed everything I provided and more. My husband's operation was larger, older, and more interconnected than even his mother had implied. Money laundering, obstruction, classified manipulation, and a chain of influence that reached far beyond our city. He was not a mastermind, but he was essential. A trusted operator. Replaceable but valuable. That made him arrestable. I had followed every instruction exactly. I altered nothing. I warned no one. I played my role flawlessly because I understood that justice requires patience more than passion. The FBI did not rush. They waited for the moment when denial would be impossible, when intervention would dismantle not just him, but the illusion that protected him. That moment arrived just after sunrise. Unmarked vehicles appeared first, blending into the landscape so seamlessly that most people would never notice. Then came the knock, not loud, not aggressive, but authoritative. A sound that carries weight because it does not need volume. The kind of knock that ends chapters, not starts conversations. I did not react outwardly. I had been preparing for this sound longer than anyone knew. When the agents entered, the air changed immediately. Professional. Focused. Unimpressed by status or reputation. They moved with certainty, not curiosity. This was not a question. It was an execution of process. My husband's composure fractured in slow motion. He attempted calm first, then confusion, then indignation. He referenced influence, misunderstanding, procedural error. None of it mattered. His words bounced off trained indifference and fell to the floor unused. I stood aside, silent, exactly where I had been instructed to be. The arrest unfolded efficiently. Documents were presented. Rights were read. Physical restraints applied with unemotional precision. The man who once controlled rooms with presence alone was reduced to compliance within minutes. Power, I learned, evaporates instantly when it depends on secrecy. As they escorted him out, he finally looked at me, not with rage, not with accusation, but with something far more revealing. Recognition. In that moment he understood. Not the details, not the timeline, but the source. He saw the shift in me, the absence of fear, the quiet resolve. He realized that his mother's final act had not been silence, but succession. The door closed behind him. The sound was final. What followed was not relief. It was gravity lifting. The house felt larger, lighter, as if walls had been holding their breath for years. Federal agents remained, methodically cataloging, seizing, documenting. Every hidden compartment, every encrypted drive, every lie that had been embedded into architecture was extracted and labeled. I answered questions when asked. I clarified timelines. I provided context without emotion. They treated me not as a victim, but as a collaborator who had chosen alignment with truth over comfort. That distinction mattered. By nightfall, the story was no longer private. News outlets began reporting the arrest of a respected figure. Language shifted rapidly from allegations to evidence. The narrative fractured as journalists uncovered what influence had concealed. Photos of my husband in handcuffs circulated, stripped of their former polish. His name trended not as an icon but as a cautionary example. And with exposure came fallout. Phones rang without pause. Former allies distanced themselves. Associates denied knowledge. The machine cannibalized itself in an attempt to survive. No one wanted proximity to the truth once it became visible. Loyalty dissolved instantly when risk replaced reward. I did not answer the calls. My role was complete. In the days that followed, I entered a different kind of isolation. Protective protocols activated. Legal processes unfolded. My identity became partially obscured, shielded not by anonymity but by necessity. I moved quietly, deliberately, as the world recalibrated around the absence of a man who had believed himself indispensable. What surprised me most was not the speed of his fall, but the silence that followed. Once removed from power, he became irrelevant almost immediately. The machine adjusted. New names surfaced. New investigations opened. He was a chapter, not the book. And I was free. Not because justice had been served. Trials take time. But because truth had replaced illusion. I no longer had to perform belief in a lie. I no longer had to minimize my instincts to preserve comfort. The psychological weight I had carried for years dissolved the moment accountability entered the room. I thought of his mother then. I understood her at last. Her final whisper had not been an attempt at redemption. It had been containment. She knew her son would eventually be removed, but she wanted to choose the moment, the witness, the successor to silence. She chose me because she knew I would not flinch. In dismantling him, I had completed what she could not. But this was not the end. Arrest is only the opening act in stories like this. Trials expose more than guilt. They reveal networks, compromises, and the cost of complicity. And as the investigation expanded, I realized that my role was evolving again. I was no longer just the key. I was the example. Because when powerful men fall, others begin to look around and wonder who else might be watching. Who else might be listening? Who else might decide that silence is no longer worth the price? The queen does not need to announce herself. Her presence is felt when structures collapse. The world did not pause after his arrest. It surged forward, loud and relentless, determined to consume every detail of the collapse. Court documents replaced wedding photos. Headlines rewrote legacies overnight. The man once protected by silence became defined by exhibits and case numbers. And I became something else entirely. I became the woman who survived the epicenter. The days following the arrest blurred into a new rhythm shaped by legal procedures and protective measures. Federal agents checked in regularly, not to extract more information but to ensure stability. I was no longer a source. I was a variable that needed safeguarding. That distinction changed everything. It confirmed what I had suspected all along. Once truth is released, those who carried it are no longer expendable. I relocated quietly, leaving behind the house that had been a museum of secrets. Every room echoed with memories I no longer needed. Objects once symbolic of status now felt irrelevant, even contaminated. Wealth without integrity is just weight, and I was determined to travel light. The legal process unfolded methodically. Evidence I had helped preserve surfaced in court filings, each document dismantling another layer of his constructed identity. Shell companies lost their anonymity. Financial pathways were mapped with ruthless clarity. Names I had never heard were exposed as collaborators or beneficiaries. The operation bled outward, staining everything it touched. And then came the plea negotiations. Men like my husband do not confess easily. They negotiate. They trade information for reduction, loyalty for leverage. He attempted to bargain with fragments of the truth, hoping to control the narrative even as it unraveled. But the volume of evidence rendered his strategy obsolete. Cooperation became survival, not power. Watching this unfold from a distance was surreal. The man who once dictated outcomes was now reacting to them. His voice, once decisive, was reduced to testimony weighed by credibility he no longer possessed. The courtroom did not care who he had been. It cared only about what could be proven. And there was much to prove. As the case expanded, more arrests followed. The machine did not collapse all at once. It cracked and splintered, exposing its internal weaknesses. Each fracture validated my choice. This was not personal revenge masquerading as justice. It was structural correction. So the cost was real. Public scrutiny turned its gaze toward me, though never fully. Speculation replaced certainty. Some framed me as a victim, others as complicit, a few as calculating. I let them wonder. Explanation is a luxury reserved for people who owe nothing to truth. I owed everything. Privately, I confronted the psychological residue of years spent in controlled proximity to danger. Safety does not immediately feel safe when your nervous system has been trained to anticipate collapse. There were nights when silence felt unfamiliar, when peace seemed suspicious. Healing, I learned, is not passive. It is an act of reclamation. I rebuilt deliberately. I chose anonymity over recognition, substance over appearance. I invested time in understanding myself outside the context of marriage, power, and survival. For the first time, my decisions were not reactions. They were intentions. And something unexpected happened. Other women reached out. Quietly, cautiously, through indirect channels. Some had known my husband professionally. Others had lived inside similar marriages, orbiting men whose influence insulated them from consequence. They asked not for details but for confirmation that escape was possible. That silence could be broken without annihilation. I did not position myself as a savior. I shared what mattered. Preparation, patience, documentation, and timing. Truth, when handled strategically, is not a weapon. It is a lever. The ripple effect expanded beyond my story. Institutions reviewed policies. Organizations distanced themselves from figures once deemed untouchable. The absence of one man exposed how much had been built around him. And when those structures fell, new ones formed with greater transparency. I watched all of this with measured detachment. Power had changed hands, not to me but away from illusion. And that was enough. Occasionally I thought of my former mother-in-law. Not with resentment, not even with forgiveness, but with understanding. She had lived long enough to realize that legacy is not what you protect, but what you prevent from continuing. Her final act had been neither kindness nor cruelty. It had been responsibility. The final stage of the trial approached with inevitability. Sentencing loomed. The narrative was no longer contested, only concluded. My husband's future would be defined by confinement and irrelevance. A fitting end for a man who believed control equaled permanence. I did not attend the courtroom. Some closures are internal. On the day the verdict became public, I stood alone, not in triumph but in completion. The cycle that had begun with a whisper ended with institutional certainty. What remained was not vengeance but clarity. I was no longer defined by what I had survived. I was defined by what I had ended. And as the world moved on, hungry for the next spectacle, I remained rooted in a quieter truth: that real power does not announce itself. It waits, it watches, and when the moment arrives, it moves without hesitation. The queen does not rule through fear. She rules through consequence. The world remembers endings more vividly than beginnings, but it rarely understands what follows. After the verdict, after the headlines faded, after the machine that once defined my life was dismantled piece by piece, I entered a phase few people talk about: the quiet aftermath of truth. Justice had spoken, but it did not linger. My husband's sentence was finalized without spectacle. Numbers replaced narratives. Years replaced names. The man who once commanded attention became a file stored in a system designed to forget him. There was no dramatic farewell, no final confrontation, no need for closure that required his presence. Accountability does not require reconciliation. What mattered was what remained. I walked forward without the burden of secrecy, but also without the illusion that exposure alone heals. Freedom is not a switch. It is a practice. Each day required me to choose stability over adrenaline, purpose over reaction. I built routines that honored peace rather than chaos, clarity rather than control. The identity I reclaimed was not the one I had before marriage. That version of me had been shaped by optimism and assumption. The woman who emerged was forged through discernment. She trusted herself not because she believed the world was kind, but because she knew she could navigate it honestly. I no longer feared powerful men. I understood them. I understood how they rise, how they recruit silence, how they mistake loyalty for immunity. And I understood their greatest vulnerability: the belief that the systems protecting them are eternal. They are not. They depend on people choosing comfort over conscience. I chose differently. Over time, I became a consultant in quiet ways. Not publicly, not visibly. Institutions sought insight from someone who had lived inside the architecture of corruption and walked out intact. I spoke in frameworks, not anecdotes. In patterns, not pain. I taught how power disguises itself and how truth, when documented and timed, dismantles it efficiently. My past became a resource, not a wound. I never remarried the idea of innocence. Instead, I committed to awareness. I cultivated a life rooted in independence, intellectual autonomy, and boundaries that required no explanation. I traveled. I learned. I invested in causes that valued prevention over punishment. The future felt expansive because it was no longer constrained by performance. Occasionally, I was asked if I felt guilt. The answer surprised even me. I felt none. Guilt belongs to those who benefit from harm or enable it through silence. I had interrupted harm. I had refused to inherit it. That is not betrayal. That is responsibility. I thought often about the moment my mother-in-law chose me. She had seen something in my restraint, my observation, my patience. She had recognized that strength does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits until the cost of silence outweighs the risk of truth. Her final whisper had been an invitation. I accepted. In the end, this story was never about a husband taken away by federal agents. It was about a woman who refused to be collateral damage in someone else's empire. It was about understanding that love without integrity is a liability, and loyalty without ethics is complicity. Most importantly, it was about reclaiming authorship. I did not rewrite the past. I redefined its meaning. The house where secrets once lived is gone from my life. The name I once carried no longer defines me. The fear that once governed my instincts has been replaced by something far more durable: self-trust. And that is the true ending. Because when silence is finally free, it does not echo. It settles. And in that stillness, the queen does not seek revenge. She builds a future where her voice is never optional again.